All right, greetings, friends and comrades, and welcome back for our final session to discuss the conclusion to the political unconscious, the dialectic of utopia and ideology, which begins with a bold provocation that we should think about reversing Walter Benjamin's famous phrase that every document of civilization is, at the end of the day, a document of barbarism. And this, I think, gives us the kernel of what Jameson means by a dialectical reading of texts, in the sense that what he's after here is a sort of split within, because he then pivots to a conversation about Marshall Sahlins' article, which it's actually a book on culture, called Culture and Practical Reason. And in this article, he chastises classical Marxism in a way similar to what we saw with the mechanistic model of causality in chapters one and two. Actually, sorry, chapter one, where basically ideological forms don't allow us to actually arrive at something like a point of meaning of the text. Ideological forms in classical Marxist literary criticism, Jameson senses, become to what Sahlins call functionalist. In other words, they don't help us either identify something like what he calls the political unconscious, which is the sort of source of the absent cause of history, or the source of the kind of breakdown of meaning or something like that, which then reveals kind of like the real of the drama of the text. But nor does it actually allow us to locate another example he thinks as what he calls like a positive version of Marxist literary criticism, would be Mikhail Bakhtin's notion um, of dialogical imagination, which is like a way to read 19th century bourgeois novels in ways that their form and their theories escape the immediacy of the bourgeois society in which they take place. And then he also has this point that Adorno and Horkheimer, in their theory of the culture industry, try to develop something similar vis-a-vis a conception of strong memory, which I was actually less familiar with. But just to review from last time, it's important to note, and I went back and I read Reification in Utopia, published, I think, in 1979, this long essay that he wrote, where he makes a strong claim that we can define modernism as a reaction to the commodification of art objects, or of cultural products, meaning that this is one of the problems with reification itself, whereby it becomes unclear, on the one hand, whether there is a true distinction between sort of like high and low art, uh, in terms of the fact that even within uh, high art, there still has the possibility of a type of commodification, and a commodification which is a reflection of the reification of experience itself. And what is that defined as? Jameson defines it very clearly as the tailorization of human experience. So it's literally like, even though he's uneasy about this idea of mechanically applying something like a base to a superstructure concept, in a way, that is what reification is doing, right? Which is like advances in labor discipline and labor routines are effectively liquidating the possibility of singular experiences. And so, like in the late 1970s, he uses the examples of the way that vacations happen, even before social media, before the internet. He's like, vacations now happen whereby the experience is replaced with the desire to capture it in a photograph. And so that's why he then says, like, this French collective tel quel, as well as the Situationists and Debord, become extremely instructive, precisely because the object in which reification becomes most concentrated, of course, is the image. And we saw with the study of Lord Jim and with Conrad, a certain way in which Conrad is sort of out ahead of his own historical period, pointing to a high modernist sort of genre, but even sort of experimenting with forms of postmodern schizophrenic, dissociative styles of artistic expression. And so now within all of this condition, I want to read a passage which I will only read somewhat as a Frederick Jameson making a rebuttal and a clarification to the young independent Marxist critic Tony McKenna, who I said before in his book on the way that the Frankfurt School and Jameson abandoned Marxism, precisely by construing reification in as purely on the side of consumption, but no longer tethered to the theory of labor power. Let me just quickly read this passage regarding the definition of reification, if I might. Okay, this is from 1979, Reification in Utopia essay by Jameson. He says, quote, "The concept of the commodity cuts across the phenomenon of reification. And we can describe this in terms of activity or production from a different angle. We can also describe it in terms of consumption. In a world in which everything, including labor power, has become a commodity, ends remain no less undifferentiated than in the production schema. They are all rigorously quantified and have become abstractly comparable through the medium of money, their respective price or wage. Yet, we can now phrase their instrumentalization, their reorganization along the means-ends split in a new way by saying that by its transformation into a commodity, a thing of whatever type, it has been reduced to a means for its own consumption. It no longer has any qualitative value in itself, but only insofar as it can be used. The various forms of activity lose their immanent intrinsic satisfactions as activity, and they become means to an end. The objects of the commodity world of capitalism also shed their independent being and intrinsic qualities and come to be so many instruments of commodity satisfaction. And then he uses the example of like going to be like a tourist, where you are sort of unable to, like, there's a kind of sadness when you like whatever do tourism or when you travel, in the sense that your fantasy of the travel would be that you might inhabit that rare moment of like a singular experience with the landscape, with the surroundings, with the city. But the inevitability of modern life is that that is overwrought by reification, by these by the rush of the immediacy of experiences sort of liquidated from your consciousness. He says, quote, "The concrete activity of looking at a landscape, including no doubt the disquieting bewilderment with the activity itself, the anxiety that must arise when human beings, confronting the non-human, wonder what they are doing there, and what the point or purpose of such a confrontation might be in the first place, is thus comfortably replaced by the act of taking possession of it and converting it into a form of personal property. So if you're willing to entertain the possibility that reification and the emergence of increasingly materialized signifiers are one and the same phenomenon," because he then goes on to basically make this claim that because Lukács, as a Marxist philosopher, maintains a commitment to a theory of consciousness that is grounded within a collective of a class, and moreover, that the consciousness of that class is capable of positioning an overcoming of this condition, right? That's like a kind of positive affirmation of history and class consciousness. Jameson says the Althusserian alternative offers something completely different than that. And in fact, he says in the conclusion, you may remember, that as it pertains to social class, which is the locus of ideology and utopia for Marxist literary criticism, what does he say? He says Althusserianism can't contribute anything. which I really was very happy that he said that in some sense, because at least it seems to be very honest in a way. In part, I think this is the case because uh, there doesn't seem to be, and maybe others would disagree with this, the foothold by which Jameson is building this conception of utopia is not influenced on structural causality. It's influenced, I think, on Ernst Bloch's principle of hope primarily. That's primarily where it's coming from. It's coming from, like, in other words, philosophically, a kind of Marxist Hegelianism, right? In reality, it's like a Marxist Schelling Hegel tripartite system in Bloch, which you may be aware of. Like, the principle of hope's basic premise is, in essence, that all class consciousness is utopian. All class consciousness is utopian because there is this sort of affirmation of a possibility that the working class taps into what he calls sort of like uh, the not yet conscious, which is a whole thing. Jameson doesn't get into it, but it's something that I've written about. It's something that I've done a video on, and it's something that interests me greatly. Just in short, he does a sort of historicism of consciousness. And on the one hand, he sort of would argue in agreement that something like the total liquidation of reification of experience happens in modernity. But he thinks that pregnant within modernity at the same time are these sort of elements, these shards of the not yet conscious, that kind of emanate from past historical movements and experiences, but that also express what you might call partial sites of the yearning for totality, which is repressed or frustrated, right? And so he literally thinks that Freud's conception of the unconscious is only historically made possible in conditions of modernity, which have foreclosed the possibility of this access to a form of consciousness which would be to the birth of something new. So Bloch is a very interesting thinker, and you can see why the post-structuralists would be drawn to him, because they are obsessed also with this distinction between event and structure. And Bloch sort of kind of has a theory of the event in a certain way. Okay. So that's a slight diversion there. So, but yes, all class consciousness is utopian, he says on page 289. And what that means is that the truth of the ruling class, according to the Marxist view, is an expression ultimately of forms of stifled or repressed or degraded or dominated forms of consciousness of the working class. And I felt that that becomes an interesting invitation for us to actually, like, what would it mean to actually apply that? You know what I'm saying? Like, I was reading Jennifer Silva's very interesting book on contemporary working class, the millennial generation, contemporary working class, and she had this idea that uh, all of these sort of forms of protest against, on behalf of the working class in America in particular, but she also studies Britain actually, um, against the removal of, like, the possibility to reproduce the family, have given way to, like, these kind of quiet symbolic forms of protest. And I noticed that a lot of that is sort of imitated by middle class interlocutors. So there is, therefore, in Marxism, the affirmation that one must study the weird, unconscious relays between classes that are not necessarily reducible to binary logics of a classical nature, in which one form of existence wishes to, like Hegel, lordship and bondage, destroy the other. That's not the truth of class, according to Marxism, in my view. Right? You could argue, apropos Losurdo's point on this notion of binary class struggle, that part of the success of bourgeois ideology is the mystification of the already established binary locus that cannot be revealed, cannot be known, which is then the task of the critic to reveal it, right? And you pay a price when you do reveal it, right? Because I would contend that communication, or communication is probably the wrong word, but that interaction, that conflictual, frictional interaction between the classes, um, itself reveals, yes, a utopian dimension, but it also reveals an ideological dimension, right? And again, the ideological dimension is what Jameson calls a negative hermeneutic. And he basically says, look, that is what Marxism reigns supreme, but providing the negative hermeneutic, which is we can uncover ideological forms. We can uncover that kind of example that I just shared about the communication between classes. Um, like the example that Silva has is what's called the mood economy, in which you have this sort of acting out on behalf of working class people, uh, whereby they inhabit kind of like a liminal space, right? Um, as a source ultimately of like a social therapeutic point. It's like a very interesting argument. And I started to notice that um, those types of patterns are also mimicked by middle class counterparts. Anyways, I've written an article where I kind of touch on that point, but I think that there's like a whole, that's actually what novels allow us to see. Novels, good class conscious novels, allow us to see. And I think another example here would be uh, what's the name of the young Marxist Irish author who wrote Normal People? Sally, what's her last name? Do you guys know who that is? Very famous.
Sally
Um,
Rooney.
Rooney.
yeah, Sally Rooney. She says this is her objective, right? Which is to reveal in her. She's like, there's a great interview I could share with you where she's like unabashedly says that this is her objective as a Marxist author. And I was very inspired to see her own the Marxist mantle with such pride. But that I think is one of the beauties, even though modernism often will shut down that kind of communicability. Right? We kind of saw that in the distinction between 19th century realists and Conrad, right? Whereby the kind of conceptual apparatus of modernism is this sort of highly individualist sort of dimension whereby social relations are not really noble. But Jameson says, I think in a beautiful way, I think Conrad has mentioned this before, is that uh, all literary criticism for Marxism is a social science. I thought that was actually very, very illuminating point, right? Okay. Now, but what actually is utopian? Well, utopian is the yearning for a form of collective solidarity that bourgeois society forecloses. So here's the interesting point about that, right? Which is that even within fascism, nationalism, or regressive forms of bourgeois ideology, you can still detect a kind of negative utopian yearning inside of them. And that I think is the heart of the beauty of this. That's what makes it such a dialectical conception, right? He made a mention to the Dialectic of Enlightenment by Horkheimer and Adorno, and he said that he kind of was inspired in part by them because what did they say about fascist racism or anti-Semitic racism? That it too conceals a kind of frustrated utopia, right? So, I mean, I guess my only pushback to that would be, um, how would one operationalize such a criticism on today's left? I was thinking about that, and I'm not sure if it's possible. In other words, what he's really saying there is like a highly uh, sort of sort of method of. I mean, it's like so far from ultra leftism. If we define ultra leftism I've come up with a recent definition of ultra-leftism, which is that you could maybe define ultra-leftism as a refusal to submit to any possible interior subjective transformation within capitalism itself. Hmm? So, as such, experimentation in ideological forms, whether they be irrationalist, whether they be mystified, whether they be religious, whether they be fascistic, you see, Jameson's giving a highly charitable reading of them. No, he's saying as leftists, we need to honor and recognize and see the Janus face in them. There's another side to them that we can restore, that we could resurrect, that we could work with. That is against so much of the culture. Maybe it's a cultural issue on the contemporary left. I suppose that dovetails with our initial conversation regarding cancel culture in some sense, but I'm not sure. I would love for people to think about that or to see what you think about that. Yes. So we have a positive and a negative hermeneutic function. Where the positive hermeneutic needs to be careful, though, is that it should not fall sway to a pure religion. This is like Northrop Frye. And it's also like Norman O'Brien, bless his heart, right? Whereby libidinal transfiguration, yeah, the utopian fusion, right? This kind of organs without bodies, right? Is well, Jameson's he's a bit unclear though, because at the same time, what does he say? He says, yes, well, because Marxism is revolutionary, it can think collective solidarity in such a way that all of the forms of solidarity that were religious or functionalist in a Durkheimian sense will be seen as limited and reliant on bourgeois parliamentary structures once we've overcome prehistory. But then it's like, yeah, but what does that mean to overcome prehistory? He doesn't really say. It is kind of a vague conception of revolution. So one of the things I think is missing in this conclusion is actually a conversation regarding the meaning of revolution itself. I also want to share this. For those of you that are familiar with the Japanese Marxist philosopher Kojin Karatani, who you know I'm very fond of, this is exactly what he theorizes vis-a-vis the theory of mode D. Yeah. Andrew's getting some affirmative fist bumps. Yeah, because this is exactly what this is. It's sort of a kind of what actually does Marxism say regarding the, well, what does Karatani call mode D? What's a synonym of mode D? And this is something he gets from Ernst Bloch.
Isn't like the
No,
return?
mode D as in the letter D. There's A, B, C, and D. It's in the structure of world history. Right? So there's it's the four predominant modes of collective organization. You see, Kojin Karatani read The Political Unconscious because he was a comparative literary student of Frederick Jameson. And at the end of The Political Unconscious, what does he say is the task of the theorist? It's to develop what's missing in Marxism is a strong theory of collective organization, basically. And I would contend that Karatani kind of produces that in the structure of world history, frankly. But yes, Charles, what mode D is a recurring tendency of communities, nations, and groups to engage with a grand return. And here, the Asiatic mode of production could be thought along this line, whereby it gives us a social form of organization in which this sort of oneness or the unity of the society is resolved through something like a kind of Freudian primal father figure, right? What mode D is a return at a higher level to a form of primitive communism based on a logic of exchange of reciprocity, fundamentally. And so you have sort of like primitive mode A as, in essence, kind of like basic uh, gift exchange. Then you have mode B, which is based upon um, plunder and pillage, and it's based on a kind of social contract that's Hobbesian. And I don't know why this stupid thing is doing that. So let me put the hand down. Um, I can't do it right now. Then that's mode B, okay, kind of feudal-esque, but the periodization's not exactly linear. Why is it not linear? Because these modes repeat in a brilliant way, and they interrelate. Yeah, you have to think them as bound up with in a relationality with one another at any given time. And then you have mode C, which is, and each mode is assigned a sort of thinker. Mode C is Marx. It's commodity exchange. It's commodity exchange. It's modernity. It's 1848 to the present. But mode D is this kind of operator, which is a logic of death drive. He calls it a logic of death drive of history. It's the return of religion. It's the return of a form. You could also theorize this in nice Bordiga sense as like communist invariance. Sorry, I sound like Robert F. Kennedy. My voice is all fucked up from I have some kind of summer cold. Although I kind of like the way he talks, but anyways. So we should find out if Karatani was influenced by Jameson in this matter. I think it's possible that he was, in fact. Um, and yeah, he says Sartre's critique of dialectical reason attempted to do this, but no, he says nobody talks about it. And I was talking to Ray Brassier recently, and he was saying the same thing, and we were kind of commiserating on the fact that nobody reads the critique of dialectical reason, but you have to understand that perhaps it was such a powerful intervention at its time in the 1950s that it influenced like a whole generation of people who then went off to build like original thought without referencing it. It's kind of like a curse of being like a Sartre. If that makes sense. You know what I mean? Because it's not like you can just reference Sartre as a footnote. No, no, no. He sort of is giving you a mode by which you're rethinking things in a fundamental sense, right? He's like truly influencing people. Badiou is the number one example of that, in my view. Yeah, he's totally like a vanishing mediator. And yes, Modi is also discovered by Kant vis-a-vis the theory of the kingdom of ends, which is why Karatani makes the beautiful claim that Kant is the first socialist philosopher, which will bother people. But if you read him, he gives you a great Kant. He gives you an excellent Kant. Okay. So look, I mean, the reversal of every document being a document of barbarism is made possible by this dialectical theory of utopia, pregnant within class consciousness. The other impetus, by the way, of this turn to thinking collectivities and organizations and groups and is, of course, inspired by Althusser, even though he, just as I said, says Althusser cannot help us think social class, which, of course, I want to hear what Conrad has to say about that as a great defender of Althusser. So even though he says that, he then pivots to say, well, we still need a theory of social class, not based on experience. Right? And I don't know. I just wrote a long essay on Althusser where I kind of concluded by saying, actually, we do need we do need that. There's a lot of interesting taboos, almost like a Althusserian superego has been imposed on contemporary Marxists to not utter. And of course, we know why. The way that personal experience is abused. But nonetheless, I still feel that there is like, Kluge and Knecht in their public sphere and experience book, I think get very close to like a systematic philosophical theory of experience that I find quite interesting. And moreover, let me just say this and then I'll stop. with my opening remarks, I think Jameson says that structuralism, even though it eschews experience, what it's really trying to do is structure experience, right? Provide a structural account of experience. So it's not totally accurate to say that experience is completely sidelined in these kind of philosophies. There's probably some more things that I could say regarding the conclusion, but I don't want to hog the floor. So I will stop and turn it over to Conrad for his remarks. Welcome to everyone that has joined. Um, I think Conrad, it must be having Chinese uh, internet issues of some variety. But that's okay. He'll come on when he comes on. I'm telling him that he should like try to find a way to go to like his university to do these programs with us. Um, anyways, I like to give him a hard time. We're tired of seeing your bed, right? People are tired of seeing my bookshelf. So what can you say? Uh, but yes, thoughts on all of this. You know, I think it's actually worth reading the Marshall Selene's book. I'll post it in Discord. It's very accessible. It's very interesting. He's this anthropologist who's basically trying to ask the question, can Marxism legitimately be applied to what's called primitive societies? And anyways, I haven't finished it yet, but it seems like an absolutely essential intervention. Go ahead, Andrew, please.
Yeah, so really thinking about like, what we've been talking about in this group, and then also just kind of familiarizing myself with a lot of Jameson's other works. It seems like Utopia is the sort of concept he's building up in his entire career. And obviously, like, it's not like utopian socialism and like the utopianists prior to Marx or during Marx's time, but like, is he trying to say, using kind of the point you made about Karatani with Modi, that there's a sort of embedded um, vision of utopia that he sees not only within Marxism but within like literature up until now, about something that sort of transcends the current state of affairs or the current social relations. To use Karatani again, it's like the utopia is a sort of repetition of the unconscious, right? Of the political unconscious, like in the form of like some type of drive or demand. Because Karatani will say that, like, yeah, mode D is like the death drive, but it's like what's returning is this sort of demand for like mode A in a higher form, right? And so in the Jameson sense, is utopia somewhat synonymous with that throughout his entire work. And last thing I'll say is, because I know, for instance, he did that one anthology on the was it the two power structure or something on the army, where I think he says something that the army has this sort of
Right.
structure that would kind of materialize this idea of utopia. And I think from being in the military, there is something socialistic about the military, regardless of the intentions that the American military has via capitalism and
Right.
imperialism.
No, I mean, I think there's several things going on here, right? Which is, there's been a long dormancy period within Marxism under the Stalinist experience, right? In which utopia was sort of not a part of the picture, or utopia was like repressed, as in like this is it. And there's another dimension that I didn't mention here, which is utopia as expressed through the carnival, through the festival, through the ludic and the Dionysian. So the utopian, tragically, as you probably know, was absolutely a part of the reconstituted revolutionary society with 1917 and the Bolsheviks. And, they put a huge series of debates and conversations regarding culture, the meaning of cultural revolution, right? But all of that, seemingly regressed under Stalin. So there has to be there was a need to re-theorize a new way of conceiving of utopia. So there's that aspect. And then the other aspect is purely from the rudiments of this critique of ideology that he's developing. Um, what he's trying to sort of locate, right, is that if modernism is reifying and liquidating an experience, as we've articulated earlier, um, that creates this ethical binary, which we looked at in Conrad, of the kind of the sort of it creates a crisis in values, whereby uh, what do we lose? We lose access to what utopia allowed us initially the promise of having access to, which is something like the totality, right? So what Jameson is primarily interested in, apropos a study of ideology and the underpinning of utopia, is the way that there is pregnant within ideological forms, even regressive and reactionary ones, a kind of stunted or undeveloped utopia. And this kind of goes to this notion that Marxists should be in the business of reappropriating ideologies, right? That kind of goes to my comment about whether such a project is possible. I'm very attracted to it, because at first I was very like critical of his theory of cultural revolution. But I think actually, if you incorporate this notion, it becomes very different. It becomes very positive. It becomes very constructive, right? Um, you know what I'm saying? Um, Perhaps that's a question of like the left itself. Now, um, so no, so he's not. First of all, Bloch. He's not doing what Bloch does. He's taking Lukács's side against Bloch. Lukács was not comfortable of historiography, which would be pre-capitalist. Exactly. Notice that Lukács never really talks about Engels' book on Munzer and the peasants, right? He's still wanting to reform Stalinism. Stalin, they were very wary of that too, somewhat for good reason. Because, Bloch gets into this sort of like historical opening whereby he's capable of sort of applying the not yet conscious and utopian risings of class movements and liberation movements to like slave revolts and to pre-capitalistic places, Spartacus. Um, it's quite interesting. If you read The Principle of Hope, he gives you these vignettes where he studies, he thinks that utopian sentiment is found in like the spontaneous demands and slogans of people that emerge. The best example is, say, Seurat, Seurat of the Jacobins in the French Revolution, where right at the moment where the reign of terror begins to, right before it happens, they concoct this utopian song. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. Right. So they retain an optimism. That's the other thing that's very positive about Bloch, is that he thinks fundamentally that emancipatory politics taps into a type of optimism. I've always been drawn to his thought for that reason, I think, collective or like organic optimism in some sense. Um, so yeah, Bloch adds an interesting element here, doesn't he? I mean, he adds a sort of, I mean, it doesn't seem like Jameson is going to win many friends by saying we should reverse Walter Benjamin's dictum. Because everybody quotes that, but who would challenge it? The barbarism quote, right? Um, so yes, yeah. I mean, I don't know. Perhaps, uh, yeah. I mean, I think the other thing here, Andrew, is the centrality of social class. I found so sort of like demonstrative and sort of refreshing, because on the one hand, he's saying that social class um, does not have to be reduced to a mechanistic base expression of superstructure, but that it's like this dialectic of a kind of interaction, right? In which the truth of class, the truth of the proletariat, can be found within bourgeois novels. So like that would be like a good, and I think a lot of Jameson students are happy to say this a lot, which is that like, oh, why are you reading George Eliot, or why are you reading like bourgeois novels or something? Like, why are you reading this? Well, he's making the argument that pregnant within their consciousness is their domination over the working class. You just have to read it to find it. Yeah. Carrick, please. You are muted. Please.
Oh yeah. What I think I was thinking. Can you hear me clearly? Are you able to hear me?
I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Can you hear me now? One moment. Is this better?
That's better for sure.
Yeah, I had my phone in its face.
No worries.
As far as understanding a utopia, I think it does connect to people's vision, especially Marxists, of what a normal person is. I mean, you mentioned normal people. It's like you want to think about what would be best for everybody, or at least everybody being the working class, but we we tend to base our view on what everybody means on I think more, how do I explain it? It's hard to know what everybody in the working class wants if there's so many like fetishes of what the working class is that like even people in the working class buy into, like Hazaldine thinking that normal people that he's trying to reach are just these stereotypes of the worst MAGA person you can imagine, and that most working class people are like that. If you structure a utopian vision around that, it's probably going to be hell for most people. um, and it made me think about the binary logic of class is like it's like instrumentalization for thee, which would be like mass culture, what most people can consume, what we can
Hmm.
afford to access. And then it's like high context, co created, curated culture for the rich. But we can get this vision that just because only rich people can afford it, that we should just exclude it from
Right.
our imaginary, and that no working class person actually likes that shit, which is not true. You look at how many people chase fame. I think one of the number one things that people want to be in Gen Z or Gen Alpha is like they want to be a YouTuber when they're asked as children. So like we have like this mixed idea of what the working class is because nobody really knows. Even in the working class, you're segmented by markets basically and what you
Hmm.
can afford. So it's like, how do you build a utopian vision when everything's so segmented? And even Marxists have these fetishistic views of what everybody means in terms of the working class.
Yeah, I think this is beautiful. I mean, and Julie, I'm very excited to hear what you have to say, but one motif would be that popular culture depictions of excessive leisure of rich people is a perfect example of a kind of frustrated utopian impulse, and that the mere popularity of that as a form indicates an unfulfilled desire. So it's almost like this paradoxical reading. It's very psychoanalytic, where the sight of identifications with popular cultural objects that elicit a frustrated or dissatisfied position kind of can be read subversively as a desire for a universal, or as a desire for something total that's otherwise lacking, right? That's kind of one way I'm reading this as a method. Julie, please.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. So to prepare for tonight, I read this article by Peter Fitting called "The Concept of Utopia in the Work of Frederick Jameson," published in 1998. And he talks about Jameson's interest in utopianism and writing about utopian and Marxist forms as coming out of the 1960s flowering of science fiction, as well as the rediscovery of the Frankfurt School and the work of Herbert Marcuse, who wrote a book in 1955 called Eros and Civilization. And I haven't read this book. I'm a little bit familiar with it, but it makes sense when we go back to that problematic part that you were talking about how the individual cannot experience the totality. He says in here at one point that you can't experience it through pure lucidity, and that it must be collective unity. And I tried to operationalize that. Like, what would that look like? And I was just letting my mind wander. And I thought about like a big popular demonstration, right? One individual perspective of that demonstration doesn't show you the picture. Like, one person gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to go to this demonstration. They go downtown and then whatever. And then they take the train home and then go to bed. And that doesn't really tell us anything, right? But the act of the mass, the collective unity of the mass of people demonstrating, like we saw in 2020, that is the totality made up of the collective. So yeah, when you ask the question, how do we operationalize that? I think we have to go back to Marcuse for that.
Yeah, I mean, Marcuse doesn't appear too much in this book. It's really, I mean, really, it is. You're right, though, because I mean, whoever, I mean, the author of the what was his name?
Um, Peter Fitting.
Fitting. Cool. Okay. Yeah. Um, I think there's a number of Marxist theoreticians that are thinking this. It's not only in the 60s, it really starts in the 50s. It's this kind of question about the loss of what I call a transitive relation of the working class to social structure, right? So it's like in the post-war period, driven by factors of automation in industry, driven by the rise after the war of a new class of bureaucrats, the new class, the PMC, what would eventually be called that. The class system changes in ways whereby consciousness in the Hegelian mode, as Lukács theorized it in the 20s in History and Class, no longer kind of gives us this sort of avenues by which we can think the liberation of the working class. And I think that Jean-Paul Sartre's probably the most influential here, because what he's trying to think is how you can sustain momentary breaks from what he calls seriality. It's a concept that he has, which is sort of akin to, I think, this idea of the regimentation of experience, or reification itself. Right. So it's like, it's very interesting, right? Because part of what is interesting about literature and art is that on an individual libidinal level, that's what it's doing to you. It's actually detailorizing your psyche, if that makes sense, right? It's like de-instrumentalizing you if it's good, if it's pushing you, if it's challenging you. Right? Now, the portrayal of that within art at a collective level, of course, is not that common. It was supposed to be in socialist and proletarian realism, right? Where the stories, and again, my interview with Alan Wald on realism is coming out soon, and he elucidates that very well. But in modernism, you don't really get those kinds of epiphanous collective solidarities. But, where you do get that is in uprisings, insurrections, strikes, and moments that point to some type of possibility. And I feel that this is like an interesting theory of like historical materialism. Like this is the ABCs of the logic of history for Marxists, like it or not, which is that I think a lot of Marxists don't like it, but I think it is actually true, which is that like we maintain that history is propelled by these outlaw moments. Sartre said that in moments of collective revolt, it's the only time our humanity is revealed. He literally said that, right? And I think it's actually true. Then he has, all of these studies. I mean, you have to read the book. You should just read the Critique of Dialectical Reason. Like I said, it's insanely good. Because what he's trying to study is like concrete empirical examples of groups, what he calls fused groups that kind of organize, make solidarity, right? Because that's really what this is about, is like the future of Marxism is to figure out the organization of outlaw solidarities. This is also Alain Badiou's whole theory of the subject itself. Is what it all goes back to in the notion of what he calls the militant subject. Because in Logics of Worlds, he creates a taxonomy, right? Where you have only 4 subject positions in relationship to the appearance, because Badiou formalizes it even more beautifully. What he says is these eruptions of humanity, as I mentioned before, he calls those political truths, right? And those political truths correspond to particular ways that subjects can respond to them, right? And what is it? The faithful subject, the reactionary subject, the militant subject, and the subject of resurrection. And the obscure. The fascist subject is the obscure subject. They take a truth of the revolt and they try to replace it with something other than what it is. That kind of goes to this point about like mega communism. I think mega communism is fascistic in that precise way. It's trying to sort of supplant the truth of something. That introduces an interesting point regarding Jameson's optimism that fascistic forms can be worked with or something like that, as we see here. So very optimistic things to say. Perhaps he's saying that in the 1980s, in which he could afford to say it. I don't know if we can say that so easily now, because fascism is like a real thing now. It's like a real thing, Like there are fascist movements and it's real and it's not to be fucked with. This idea of appropriating it, I don't know. I'm not sure about that anymore. Kind of drawn. Religion, I can see the logic. Fascism, fuck no. Anyways, I don't know if you all agree with that, but I think Julie agrees with that. Hopefully, Andrew, what
can I add? Yeah, like to
Go ahead.
Julie's point, I think like in what she was saying, I think you kind of see an overall unified demonstration that can't be seen from one perspective with what just happened with the anti-ICE protests in LA. Like there was multiple vantage points that you see being published on social media of not one person but collectivity. Now, on the downside, you do see sort of either opportunists or like, funded groups that try to break it up. And like, from anecdotal experience, I have so many people from my hometown that are like, sadly, they're Chicano and they vote conservative. And they see one video of some influencer just like, was like, oh, yeah, I had fun at the protest and I'm repping a Mexican flag and here I am doing my part. They think that it's just like, oh, it's just a bunch of like liberals just trying to shit on America and what American freedom allows them to do. But with the reality is like, no, this is a unified movement. And you see so many people, like I've never seen Bloods and Crips be so unified in such a long time. And, it reminded me like when seeing them holding like the Mexican flag, not saying that they're Mexican, but they're down for the cause. and that they're going to fight for, you know, people being deported, reminded me of that passage in Lacerda's Class Struggle, where he says that during the Irish national liberation movement, that Engels and Marx and Marx's daughter were holding the Catholic cross, right? And so in the sense, you see that sort of solidarity being enacted in this sort of instance, just to kind of affirm Julie's point about, like, it's not because a bourgeois perspective would be to use one person's perspective as metonymic of the entire perspective that's going on, when in reality it's an entire collectivity to bring a totality, right? To bring the Lukashian totality of the collective conscious.
That's like the expressive causality, right?
The expressive, yeah.
No, that is an interesting point, and I feel that a lot of culturally conservative socialists who, because of my background, coming from the place that I come from and my parents and the fact that they don't have education, I've always felt like I could communicate with culturally conservative socialists, even though it's frustrating to me to do so. You know, one of the things they don't want to do, right, is well, not appropriate, but they seem to be hesitant regarding I would say almost like the desire for emancipation itself. I'm noticing that more and more. In other words, like, I'm noticing people project profound skepticism or doubt on the idea of I would almost contend that, like, any, like, call for liberation in a total sense, like talking about the totality and stuff, would be met with such derision in our current cultural milieu on the left in particular. Such doubt regarding the authenticity of that call, right? Because, yeah, we've dealt with a lot of contradictions, right? We've dealt with a lot of issues. I mean, especially in reading these books about cancel culture and stuff like that. It's like so many people now think that they don't have any trust if young people wish to be liberated. So it's like Judith Butler has this concept of I think she calls it a post-liberatory society in her book on the powers of subjection. I can look up the reference. I don't know the exact page number, but it's a very dark, but also perhaps accurate sort of assessment in a certain way. And I feel like that's what's needed, right? Which is, you need to galvanize moments. I mean, the Mamdani moment, of course, it's electoral and, like, there's inherent limitations with that and so on. But you can't deny the sheer sort of element of, like a penetrating optimism that emerged from it, without question, I think, you know? Of course, we need to be critical of it and hold him to account and all of that. But I suppose that the left is in need of more moments like that, you know, in need of more, like, and then I think the question for, like, philosophers and theorists is sort of like, how do we interpret those moments in such a way whereby what's our relationship to those moments in a certain way, you know? Or maybe those movements don't need a philosophical investigation. Maybe they do. I would contend that they probably do. I mean, speaking about Marcuse, it's like that was what Marcuse did for the 60s. He was the philosopher of the subjective dimensions of revolt and emancipation. In some sense, he gave an intellectual validation to them. You know? But I suppose maybe it's, like, hard to find intellectual validation to movements for emancipation today. Go ahead, Julie.
Well, I was thinking about, this idea about people that are afraid of their own liberation. And it just reminds me of the evergreen discussion in America over protests about like, oh, well, we have to be peaceful, but does that mean then that we have to like hug and kiss the cops, you know? And I just find myself in these discussions, planning protests, being like, man, whose side are you on? Whose side are you on? Because if you're afraid of your own liberation, you're not on my side.
Exactly. And well, I would even my point is similar but slightly different, which is what I'm more worried about is we haven't created a culture of trust in which like appeals to liberation at a collective level um are sort of capable of being like processed and um seen as mandatory or necessary in a certain way. And I think the reasons for that are pretty clear. The way that the liberal apparatus has co-opted movements on the one hand, but I mean, you know, perhaps there is a way that uprisings and protest activity will fundamentally upset our expectations. You know, I would venture to guess that there's some historical reason to think that uh, in our time, and this is very much like a Joshua Clover claim, you know, the author of Riot, Strike, Riot. Like, I don't agree with him that we live in an age of riots, but I do agree with this general idea that he's influenced by world systems theory, which is to say that we live in what they call the epoch of profound turbulence. In other words, social revolts have a fundamentally unpredictable character. And that is largely having to do with the dominance of financial capitalism. And so that is pretty helpful to know that. It's like as a predictive compass. So, yeah, Carrick.
Sorry, my phone case blocks my microphone. Can you hear me? Okay. You mentioned the like a culture of trust. That reminded me of an extremely online experience I had of a leftist saying trust is a liberal concept to me when I was talking about, you know, you can't make like you can't make demands of other working class people if they don't trust you yet. And that was his response. And I think in like the online context, which does reflect the fragmented nature of protests at the moment, it's that, gosh, where was I going with this? It kind of does go back to what I was saying before. If everybody has a different idea of what everybody means and what a normal person is and who they want, who they're, and Marxists, who the Marxists are fighting for, then how can you really trust anyone as soon as they violate your imaginary idea of what that is? I think that's like we're working with a lot of that. Um, and I know it's a probably a foregone conclusion at this point that no one knows what normal is. But if they don't know what normal is, if we don't know what normal is, how do we know like who to trust? Kind of
Yeah.
what I was getting at. And that I was met with that kind of questioning. I was met with trust is a liberal concept, which it's like maybe people do see the way that we're managing our trust as kind of just like the trust we're forced to have, provisional trust in like our coworkers who are kind of just forced to be around,
Yeah.
even if we don't like them, sort of trust. But we don't have alleyways for like epistemic trust that like I know how to tell if you believe the same things I believe, at least enough to trust that you're going in the same direction that I'm going. And that's the kind of trust I think has been fragmented so much.
I think that's very smart. And I feel like I'm trying to think, like, is there like is there a Marxist theory of trust? I mean, on the one hand, one would have to presuppose a kind of ubiquitous or permanent state of distrust with bourgeoisie, which of course one cannot always assume that this is the case. I mean, psychoanalysis would instruct us, right, that the proletariat must be extra cautious around forging relations of dependency to the status quo in a certain way. And I think that there is, therefore, probably trust is not really a Marxist concept. I think the only reason I used it is in this Sartrean way. Sartre refers to it as uh, an oath that's formed by the fused group, which I'm trying to think of it's forged off of a very particular like virtue, and there becomes like the need to historicize the virtue which is necessary for the group itself. So the Jacobin virtue that would galvanize their oath would be different than the, I don't know, the George Floyd uprising virtuous oath of the movement, for example. So there's that kind of historical point, I think. In other words, it's not like a trans historical point. It's like the proletariat needs to trust each other. I don't think that's the truth of class conflict, right? But all I'm simply saying is that I'm pointing to something more fragmentary regarding, and trust may be the wrong term for it, regarding the kind of like inbuilt skepticism regarding appeals to liberation as such. You know, I have the sense that we're in a kind of crisis of what you could call the value crisis that Jameson's talking about. C. Derek Varn and Lukács, they both refer to this as decadence. Decadence is crisis of values in the sense that like we lack the kind of foundational ground in which appeals to collective liberation can be sort of like rationally construed. And this kind of takes us back to this debate of Lukács' destruction of reason. I'm going to have a debate with Tony One Dime, YouTube channel guy, about the meaning of irrationalism. Because he really thinks that the Lukácsian idea of rationalism and irrationalism as a binary, he thinks that it's like terrible. And I'm going to try to defend it. So that's a whole other thing. Akshay, please. Sorry for keeping you.
No, that's totally fine. I was going to say this before you said the thing on trust, but I think it ties into the thing on trust, which is sort of that. I mean, I think trust is there, right? Both in like what is realism and utopianism, like, you know, like, and sort of, I mean, I don't know, like just in the very idea of scientific socialism as a doctrine that sort of doesn't trick the masses, right? Like, kind of is, or, and I think it ties into sort of what Jameson is kind of saying with like socialism or barbarism and like sort of, I mean, again, and this is the question I have for Jameson and for all of us, but like sort of, so let me say what I think he's doing first, but like socialism and barbarism insofar as like any fascist mobilization is like a failed communist mobilization because it's like a failure to sort of create that utopian horizon you just talked about. And it's a failure in that line of like, oh, it appears utopian. So the only realistic liberation that is possible is like, I don't know, I'll close the borders in the US, you know, and we'll like give the citizens here welfare, right? Like, so, and it sort of is like, oh, because like, how can I imagine collective liberation across nations, right? Like, workers of the world unite seems nowhere realistic, right? So why would I trust anyone who made that kind of claim? So I don't know. I mean, but so, and I think when he's saying appropriate that, it's similar to Zoran, right? Like what Zoran did is he's like appropriated Trump voters by being a communist, right? Like, but I don't know. But I guess like I wonder about So like, is the contemporary right wing like purely reactionary? Right, like, which is sort of like, I mean, in the sense that I don't know, like this right wing does seem different from the 1930s right wing in some kind of way, like, so, and it's like, and I don't know, I mean, and you know, like you'd said this other thing about like moments, but sorry, I'm losing track of my train of
No,
thought, but I
it's
guess I'll just end on this. I think like it's sort of about like utopianism, I think, is always about trust. Right? Like I think all of Jameson's talks about utopianism are like the critique of utopianism is, well, you're just like leading people, you're like stoking desires that can never be realized. But I think his sort of gamble is that, but that's sort of necessary, you know, you need, like, you can't kind of have this like the practical politics sort of, the vanguard party sort of doesn't exist without kind of the utopian horizon. I take him as saying.
yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I suppose the question apropos fascism might even be better squared if we look at like the kulaks and Stalinism, because the whole question of appropriation, especially in an American context, would have to face, and I know this because these unfortunately, well, fortunately and unfortunately, are my people. I mean, that petty bourgeois, that like down really mobile, that like reactionary conservative, that is a uncooperative social class. And and that it remains a question regarding the mobilization of socialism and the way that appropriating their desires and their inevitable because it's interesting though, because like I had this theory about social class where like if social class is this fundamental interaction, communication and symbolically, the working class appears through the phantasmic prism of the petty bourgeois. But that's only a result of the power of the petty bourgeois over the working class. And what you would have to sort of show is the way that that actually stokes a certain alienation from in that relation. It'd have to be revealed. And so I think when you say, like, is there a kind of substantial core to conservatism? I think from a Marxist point of view, you'd have to sort of perform a kind of disentanglement at the level of like class desire and sort of show working class subjects that and I think this happens already. This happens already through depoliticization. People turn against Trumpism in very passionate ways. I think it's likely that we're probably going to see a lot more of that in the future. You know what I'm saying? So like that's what I think appropriation would also have to be open to, is like, but then you'd have to ask yourself on the flip side, if within the left, and here I'm skeptical and I'm careful, I want to be careful, are we, as as nauseating as it may be, Vivek Chibber and so on, is there a certain super ego of a striving professional class that somehow dominates the consciousness, right? I'm not so sure about that. I think that a lot of that is overwrought, frankly. Anyways, I'm going in a different direction there. But Matilda, please jump in.
I feel like trust is an interesting topic in society. Does class consciousness presuppose trust in some way? It seems like we talk about allyship and solidarity. Those seem like two categories of trust in some way. I feel like allyship is like an ethical, liberal form of trust, whereas like solidarity is like, I feel like it can be sensed, but I also feel like it is classically evoked by just like Marx's Capital, kind of the basic teachings within it. And I think those can speak in a pretty unmediated way to working people without a lot of rationalism or, whatever preconditions would be necessary to know something like that. Just kind of inadvertently, trust is also widely used as a signifier within cryptocurrency. That whole premise there is to build a trustless society. And it does appeal to the petty bourgeois elements within culture, independent producers, some vision of independent producers. And maybe it's supplied by the upper bourgeoisie to them as some sort of utopian promise or something. I mean, within cryptocurrency, it's like such an interesting sphere of like what Block and what Jameson are talking about with like, there's just so much image going on within it. There's so much evocation of like archetypes and like different social forms, like a lot of like Roman images, a lot of, kind of pre-fascistic imagery and stuff is all wrapped up in the branding. I mean, you see, or, and even the branding within like tech right, you see like this whole like Lord of the Rings thing, I feel like that is in a sense what Jameson is talking about and how to like utilize art to pull in people or something. And I feel in Block, I was reading, he has like a distinction between like the synchronic and the non-synchronic, where like the synchronic contradiction is like the primary contradiction of classical Marxism, as far as I can understand, what he's saying. And it doesn't seem, I struggle to understand the use of atavistic images within that conflict. I feel like the utopian demands there are more transparent and less reliant on like imagery from history or something, or some, layered modes of production. But then like kind of folded within this idea, I think he has an idea of like layered modes of production here, uneven development, or a more like structuralist conception of it, where there's also the non-synchronic contradictions that are like simultaneous. And it seems like the non-synchronic contradictions, I feel like the question Block is asking is like, the non-synchronic contradictions would be like how to appeal to the cryptocurrency people who are like of a petty bourgeois independent producer sentiment or something. And I don't know, I feel like the question is like the non-synchronic crowd has kind of foreclosed that like the present now has something incomplete in it, and so it turns back for its reservoir of imagery and its repertoire of images to the past or something. And connecting with rationalism and irrationalism in Lukács, it seems like Lukács really does not want to play with non-synchronic contradictions and whatever aesthetics might appeal to them. It seems like for him, irrationalism, he seems only focused on like the synchronic contradiction of capitalism. It's a scientific it's rationalism versus irrationalism. And it seems like Block alternative there is like not so binary or something.
Yeah, that's true. That goes back to the Althusserian, the strength of the Althusserian layering of multiple modes of production that allow us to think also a different conception of proletarian liberation itself. Remember the comment that Jameson made regarding feminism as bound up with a desire for emancipation that is from an archaic form of oppression. Remember that? That's not to say that classical Marxism isn't capable of thinking that. I think it's slightly different than that, which is that, and there is actually an essay, I believe, on this, of Lukács's criticism of the incorporation of this loose historicist model of Bloch that I can send to you in the Discord. So look, I mean, part of the problem though is that you have to further historicize the difference, which is of the status that Lukács would then have to later in the 60s account for, which is the fact that he was kind of existing in capitalist social orders that were vulnerable to revolution, and in fact that did undergo revolutions multiple times, right? And we're not at all, right? So the 68 strategy, which is very Althusserian, again, by 1970, he writes his Ideological State Apparatuses essay. And in that essay, he already had incorporated the notion of weak revolutions, which is one of Althusser's actually great kind of contributions to Marxism, which is basically Althusser helps us think revolutions in the superstructure. It's kind of interesting, right? It's like 68 was a weak revolution. And he also calls 1848 a weak revolution in the sense that it did not revolutionize the mode of production. So I think Lukács is more concerned, obviously, with that classical form like that. And I think that Marxists should hold anyone to account that is going to deprivilege that. And I think a lot of new leftists did deprivilege classical productive revolution, right? Either through some fatalistic conception of that's just how sociology is, right? Or that's just how the economy is now, or through narcissism, which we can never fully eschew in these scenarios. Because I think the other thing is that forms of the new class and petty, I mean, what is the classical problem of the petty bourgeoisie? Classical problem of the petty bourgeoisie is that based on the imperatives of their conception of social freedom, they lack the capacity to think collective liberation. That's why they're a danger to the working class. The petty bourgeoisie is not capable of collective solidarity structurally, and I think that's a sound point. Just as an abstract formalist point, I think that's sound, in my opinion. Go ahead.
I just want to say, like, it seems like what's interesting with Bloch is like how to accumulate contradictions. Like, it seems like his task is like bundling the contradictions up, as many as possible, like these non-synchronic ones that are like from past times. Like, it's kind of like the question of like Lenin and Althusser on overdetermination, but it's rather like less a diagnostic question of like why does revolution happen in these places, but it's like how to actively do it. Maybe it's more of a voluntaristic idea behind it or something.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So much to be said, especially regarding rationalism and irrationalism, because it's not, in fact, a strong binary in point of fact, precisely because the construal of irrationalism is not reducible to some like break with sufficient reason, or yeah, it's almost like he needs more terms than he's bringing to bear to describe irrationalism. Anyways, Carrick, please.
What Matilda said about how we end up like defaulting to images that are kind of just in the social imaginary. I think that does tie into like having a utopian vision to kind of guide collective action. Is is excessive in that if you if 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 you run into a problem where people aren't on the same page about what that looks like, I do think people will default to, I forget which theorists use the term, but in fascism studies, it's called prelapsarianism, where you imagine a past that never existed, and your future utopia is to return to that past that never existed, which is obviously very image mediated, um, especially like images of the nuclear family from the 50s that never existed or could only be attained by like rich people, but then those rich people actually never took care of their kids. They had nannies doing it for them, that sort of thing. So maybe like to circumvent the problems of the split of the means and ends, you can look at an end as not utopian, like as a literal totalizing view of what's best for everybody, but as a kind of solace you can take in the process of working together. Because I do think that Sartrean trust you're talking about does require a sacrifice. Um, the sacrifice of giving other people a benefit of just like your everyday doubt.
Yeah.
Um, and to make that sacrifice, you take kind of emotional risks. So
Yeah.
there needs to be solace that in the process of working with other people for collective liberation, you're at least aiming in the same direction, like I was saying, but it can't be aimed at the same thing because
Right.
that thing would just be this totalizing best for everybody that can get very either prelapsarian or, like you said, narcissistic.
Or yeah, or
Mhm.
religious. Yeah, exactly.
I
Or
do think that the
yeah.
difference can be found in the difference between like process relational philosophy. That
Mm,
would be solidarity as a process that can involve this kind of Sartrean trust
mm-hmm.
without this like taking it as a substance where I'll only trust you if your end goal is to get to the exact same thing I imagine the future could be
Right.
if we do Marxism right. So I think
No, I
the
think you're
means
right.
and can be approached through process relational philosophy in praxis. And I do think psychoanalytically, this one post-Lacanian, I don't know if she's post-Lacanian. I think she studied a lot of like Levinas, and she does have a lot to say about Lacan. Her name is Bracha Hedinger.
Oh yeah.
Um, she coined the matrixial theory, and she talks about sacrifice in solace as kind of the only way to do it. Because
Mm,
if you look at her thing is feminism, so like women and people who care work defaults to, they make these endless sacrifices for short term solidarity with other people, giving them the benefit of the doubt, but they're never given any solace that that person's going to give any kind of, you know, they're going to, you know, give them back the sanity they've sacrificed.
mm.
So I think
Yeah.
that's kind of something that plays into collective organizing. If we can't look at the process, you're going to want to give people the benefit of the doubt. But if you can only default to a totalizing vision of the future, in absence of which you won't trust them, you're never going to feel like your sacrifice is worth it.
Yeah. Did you guys hear Marina Simakova's wonderful reference to the first or second plank of the International Working Men's Association, which became the International, where the mantra was emancipation of each worker, uh, something just to paraphrase very roughly, um, must necessitate uh, the self the self emancipation of that worker, something like that. It's like this kind of goes to this point that it's not about the construction of like some kind of noumenal object or some kind of regulative ideal. Like this is like kind of the ABCs of why Marxists have a trepidation around Kant, because Kant would be comfortable to sort of construe of socialism as a yearning for an achievement of some shared commitment to a transcendental idea or regulative idea, which is ultimately unknowable, but we can kind of position ourselves in relationship to it and have duty to it and awe to it and reverence for it and so on. I think that would be against what Jameson's pointing apropos the functionalist theory of Durkheim, right? Because Durkheim says that really that is religion is the collective crystallization of consciousness of a group, right? And Jameson rightly says this is not Marxist because ultimately you can have that till the cows come home, and we do, but still nonetheless class oppression exists. So you can't think like Durkheim and revolution is how I interpret it. Jonas, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Definitely.
Okay, cool. So I like what was being said about trust a while ago. I mean, we've been talking about the whole time, but that it's not like a worldview. It's kind of like utopia is maybe in some sense just what would have made things easier. So like, I guess in that sense, it we were talking about like could we give power to or to, could we understand like fascist why they do what they do? I think it's like I mean it's like a problem solving kind of thing. Fascism is an imaginary solution to a problem. So its utopian element might just be that something could be done about it. You know? I mean it's just like a small piece of it, the whole ideology. But for them, the utopian function works in them as well as anyone else. It's and that it could work, not just that it's the way of the world, but that something has to be done about it. I mean, every ideology does that, I guess, but noticing, I guess, wherever it occurs. I mean, I knew this kid who was, I mean, he had some sort of weird crypto Christian fascist kind of thing, but he was very enthusiastic about the idea that the education you receive in high school is incomplete, and that you have to go do things to learn how the world really works. So like, despite his bullshit ideas, he still has this kind of uplift of trying to figure it out. So maybe that even gets at what trust is in another sense, where like trust isn't just that like in some ethical ambiguity, I think you'll do the right thing, but that you can just assume that other people are also aware of something. Like, I mean, do you trust that your neighbor can read the letter for the number 5? I mean, obviously, but it still requires some minimum of sort of intersubjectivity to be able to infer that. You know, you see what I see. And we could see the breakdown of this in like the flat earth kind of thing, you know, where like you can't trust the guys who tell you how the earth is shaped. I know what it is. It's flat. And it's just a breakdown of it's not a trust of a person, but a trust of authority. And I mean, it's kind of this outburst in a ridiculous. Who cares about the shape of the earth? But like, it's figurative, you know.
Yeah. I was going to say, putting this in the chat, the concept of negative solidarity by Jason Reed is an important one to sort of index here, insofar as one of the challenges of socialism would be that one of the sort of ingenious tricks of bourgeoisie in our time, of course, is to foment, which of course in some senses is born from the structural imperatives of capitalism itself. But I think that ideologically, there's like institutional forces that encourage what Reed calls negative solidarity, right? And so like there's a part of this is the weaponization of a certain form of liberal um, individualizing of social suffering and kind of social justice worldviews that's inextricable from this process. Um, but it's also, I think, this sense in which, even in these studies that I've been doing on like love and matrimony, you know, this notion of Eva Aluz, of the end of love, you know, this whole construct. It's tied into the same notion, which is that freedom is no longer permitted or given the grounds for a positive, constructive, trust-based mode of operation, right? So like it's the conditions of the possibility of the realization of individual freedom, you could say, is kind of subordinated to like the petty bourgeois position for everyone. And Pierre Bourdieu writes about this too on the he calls it like, and I did an interview with a Bourdieu scholar on this once. He calls it like the ubiquity of the petty bourgeois habitus. Because like a habitus does not necessarily imply that one like one can kind of like be can go to Harvard and like live in an alienated way into the habitus of that community in the same way. So you see the point. It's like, in a certain way, it's like this is like the conditions of possibility have been limited in this way of negative freedom. And I feel like that's the heart of the problem of socialism in a way. It's like, how would you contest that? That's very difficult to contest that construct. Matilda.
Yeah, on this subject, that petty bourgeois habitus is like trying to be like a universal position or something. I mean, it seems like the heart of capitalist ideology as well, like this idea of like independent producer, independent going to the market. Yeah, like we all go to the market independently and maybe we produce differently now, but we're going to keep the illusion that we all produce independently. At least ideally and theoretically, we can all attain that position. I mean, that's clearly like the social organization of like a totally reified, like atomized and reified society as well. Oh gosh, just give me a second. Mine's slipping what I was going to connect that to. Oh, yeah, but there's also within this, you know, maybe you could say a non-synchronic contradiction is like Jeffersonian democracy. This is the trustless society, the society of independent producers is also the ideal society that will keep monopoly away. So there's this idea that if we do away with monopoly in all facets of life, cultural monopoly, monopoly over money, that is the cryptocurrency wager, is that there can't be a monopoly on money anymore. And it's like, is this Jeffersonian, basically this almost like atavistic Jeffersonian ideal of this unfulfilled promise of a Republican utopia that is being held out to people, that in some regard has something to it, but is not the conditions today. But it's like, how, and like, what do you do with that energy? What do you do with that utopian impulse? You know, how can it be appropriated? I think it brings in this question of, you know, MAGA communism and Jeffersonian democracy and that whole debate around that thing. I just wanted to frame that question.
I don't think MAGA communism deserves any debate or reflection. It's completely devoid of any intellectual substance entirely.
Sure. I suppose I mean also like Browderism or something.
Yeah, but that's not even close to Browderism, because Browderism was contingent on the existence of a huge socialist state that supported it and so on. Mega communism is like a criminal enterprise that's like has no thought whatsoever involved.
I do agree. There does seem to be the appropriation of the independent producer and its imagery.
Oh, sure, but but they're also trying to like break bread with Nick Fuentes.
Oh, for sure. No, it's psychotic and like
psychotic, narcissistic trap.
I suppose I shouldn't use the term so it doesn't replicate.
It's okay. We will be patiently working to extinguish all reference to them here moving forward. But yes, no, I think you're right. The other thing, though, is I was reading this guy Stoughton Lind, this new left historian. He has this genealogy. It's called The Intellectual Origin of American Radicalism. And so he basically studies like Thomas Paine and the Shays Rebellion and like the Constitution, how it was influenced by the Cherokees and like all of these like gems, right? For any like true communist to like reconnect to these sort of what would be emancipatory in American history. Christopher Lasch said that the book was like activist scholarship. Like they accused Gerald Horne of the same thing, which I think is kind of shitty, in my opinion. Because an activist scholar is like, what does that accusation really mean? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't really buy it. But nonetheless, it's worth putting that aside. I think you don't have to read it like that. You don't have to read it as like a contribution to the history in an academic valence or fashion. No, but you can read it as a socialist hungry for how to use images and ideas, right? Of like tropes, narratives in a Jameson sense. Sorry, Matilda, for freaking out about mega communism, but it's like a very serious thing for me. So I apologize for getting upset about that. But I do think that they're problematic. Okay, Jonas.
Sorry to keep going on MAGA communism, but I think it's okay. We don't like them, but I think it's kind of funny what's happening. You know, they're grasping at straws. You know, I think they're I don't know, like I won't say they're harmless, but they're mostly harmless. They're just trying to find, you know, like just any bullshit excuse. But this happens everywhere. You know, the thing about Mamdani eating with his hands. It's like you clearly don't have a good argument if this is what you're looking for. So I think maybe this shows also the breakdown in the trust of like politicians is that they can't actually have a solid take on his socialism. They just bullshit about his hands. I mean, I remember this with Obama too, you know, like oh, they said he's born in another country. But like even if that were true, who gives a shit? Like that doesn't really change anything. As if like he would have fidelity to that other country or something. But like that's not even what they're arguing, you know, it's bad arguments work because or only in the space where the real arguments like fall apart or something like that. But sorry to go on about that. I meant to actually say something else about more about Utopia and the signifier. Where I think Utopia is just maximizing some measure of something. You know, so like genetic determinism. We discover that Darwin discovers that humans are evolved. We discover DNA, and then people start to interpret the world with that. It determines your constitution, but what becomes reified is the existing ideas of that these groups of people are like this and those groups of people are like that. So then we look to like the genes to tell us the truth of race, and it doesn't actually work. You know, imagine trying to exchange phenotype for genotype. Those people are the people with this specific sequence of peptides or whatever, you know, like that would be a ridiculous way to talk about it. But genes are kind of a cover for the measure by genetic determinism is ideologically maximized. And I think that's also kind of what Utopia does, is it maximizes a measure of sorts, sometimes good, sometimes bad. So with the accumulation of contradictions is the attempt to maximize or to collect in some way the contradictions of all those signifiers that are in production. There's always movement of signifiers, but the conflicts, like the instance of genotype and phenotype and race and genetic determination, that's a contradiction that's not yet resolved, but we imagine that it is. And inevitably too, you know, like I'm very much a fan of the idea in like Althusser when he says you have to step back from ideology to find to look at things squarely, you know. Anyway,
Brilliant.
that's
No,
all I
it's
have.
amazing. It's really great. Yeah, no, thank you both for your comments. Yeah, sorry, Matilda. I was just it's just they creep me out. Sorry, that's all.
You're good.
I think you guys know by now. I know Julie knows. Okay. Brilliant. This is amazing. I think we'll close in like a few minutes, but let's hear from Mr. McGuire in the house. Welcome.
Yeah, what's up, everybody? Um, so yeah, first of all, I really liked the last chapter. I hope I'm not talking about things that you guys might have mentioned already, but you really got the sense that like Jameson was humming like in this chapter, absolutely working on all the all cylinders. Especially like this part from like 288 to 291, just on fire. But I wanted to talk about trust a little bit. This was mentioned just now. Um, Although I'm here for all of that because, you know, to be generous, it might be another word for solidarity. But um, it is unnecessary to argue these quite correct propositions. This is on page 290, talking about ethics and the ethics of forging solidarity with some people rather than others. But still, ideological commitment is not first and foremost a matter of moral choice, but of the taking of sides in a struggle between embattled groups. Politics, in a word, right? Which is to say that people are compelled to forge solidarity with one another out of necessity, subjectively determined, right? Um, and yeah, I just like, you know, you can't say an obvious thing enough or like emphasize this enough. Like, Utopia for Jameson is about sort of like getting a glimpse into or expressing, perhaps authentically, collective unity. What it really like means to belong to a group of people, right? On a very simple level. But and I also just wanted to like mention in passing, like this on page 291, where you just get a feeling like Jameson is making a serious contribution with this book, right? So it must not cease to practice. This is ideological Marxist critique. It must not cease to practice this essentially negative hermeneutic function, but must also seek through and beyond this demonstration of the instrumental function of a given cultural object to project its simultaneously utopian power as the symbolic affirmation of a specific historical and class form of collective unity. Right? Bang. It's like right there, that's like so much of what the book is about. But I just wanted to like talk a little bit more about like the utopic impulse and class struggle because Jameson name checks Hegel here and saying that the truth of any class is in its opposing class antagonism, right? And I think this then is getting into this question of like the imminence of any collectivity in its class formation, because we're talking about the other, right? And now we're talking about identity and non-identity. And I think this is then like caught up in the utopic impulse. In what sense? I forget where. I think it's in Signatures of the Visible, but at one point he's talking about Ernst Bloch. This, of course, comes from Bloch, the utopic impulse. And we have to remember that Bloch is writing about the utopic impulse while he's seeing the Nazis come to power, right? And he said somewhere, Jameson, that we have to remember that for Bloch, the utopic impulse should be understood as a warning. The utopic impulse is an incredibly explosively violent thing that people engage in. And what are they trying to do? They're trying to eliminate the other. Like the idea is that if we get rid of the other, we can realize harmonious social relationships because we are the only group that's left, right? That's one way to read it in Jameson. Does that mean it's always like that? I'm not sure. Um, but it's something to think about, right? I mean, the utopic impulse is incredibly, incredibly powerful. And yeah, it's something we should definitely keep in mind, especially in looking at, you know, fascism coming back. What do they want to do? Right? So, uh, yeah, I'm kind of like talking about a couple of things here, but yeah.
No, it's an interesting point regarding violence and what, the unity of the subject and the object as well. And I think, that haunts us as the primary proposal of Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, as that moment of crystallization of proletarian consciousness is capable of doing, that doesn't require elimination of otherness, but more of an incorporation and assimilation, I would say. But it is interesting also that there's no discussion of the party throughout this book. I don't even know if that's a term that's even used once. Right? So, one gets the sense that on the one hand, this book is about refoundationalizing Marxism in a fundamentally new direction for literary criticism. And you get that at the very end of the book, where he's going back to his original provocation, which is that beautiful phrase, which is that Marxism remains the sort of superior, I forget what he calls it, like a, not a Weltanschauung, not a paradigm, but a, I forget the word he uses, methodology. I think it's methodology. And so, I mean, I'm largely, my judgment on this text is way more positive than I initially thought that it would be. Matan, we'll go to you in just one moment. It's way more positive than I thought it would be, and I think that I probably share that with all of you. I have a few reservations about things that are ultimately quite nitpicky around choices of historicization. And I felt that the one problem I have with the text, and I'm going to write about this, was probably this confusion I have, but also sort of like this notion of absent cause of history in the political unconscious, bottoming out as a side of kind of like this post-structuralist non-meaning or collapse of meaning or denouement, that whole apparatus or strategy. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that authors are never capable, even like, magisterial authors like Balzac are not capable of actually touching something like historical totality. So I'm not sure if I share Jameson's view in that regard. But anyways, I mean, God, what a journey, man. This has been so insane. I mean, the thing I was thinking about today is I was making a list, and I'll share it in Discord, of all of the major texts that is required to read this book, like the bibliography itself, the syllabus, if you were going to teach this book. Right? I mean, you have you need to be deeply familiar with all of Lukács, all of Althusser, the Anti-Oedipus series, the Frankfurt School inside and out, all of the debates within French post-structuralism, New Historicism, Burke, what's his face, Northrop Frye, right? Huge, and Northrop Frye is like an ocean of texts to master in his own right. Lacan, right? To a lesser extent, Freud, right? Putting aside all of the mastery that one has to bring to bear regarding literature. Do you know what I'm saying? Sartre, existentialism, which Jameson was trained in, also mandatory. That's a lot. That's a lot. That's a lot. So a lot of, it's hard to read this book as a young person because, one of the brilliant things about being like a philosopher, I suppose, or an intellectual is that an AI can never take this away from us. There is like a strength of time where you actually start to okay, well, actually, I've read all of these, and that actually means something a lot different, I think, than because when I first sat down to read this, I'm like, this is tough, man. So I don't know. I would love your guys' feedback on that. Like, how did that feel for you, or were you sort of how you navigated that immensity? Or maybe it didn't feel as immense. I'm not sure. He's a great writer too, so it's still it still would be nice to know Lacan, but maybe not mandatory. Or maybe it is. I'm not sure. I think for me it would be, because you start using these terms and you can only define them so much on a few pages. The imaginary or the symbolic or name of the father. You know what I mean? Like it's. Anyways, Matan, please jump in.
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
I think I think it's quite interesting how surprisingly crude all these questions are addressed by Jameson in his American Utopia essay, where, for instance, and I hope this cuts through a few comments that I heard, he said that he practically gives a solution to trust, which is very brief, which is that there is no greater trust than that between co-conspirators. And so, well, you know what? I'll just leave things there because I could probably say more, but yeah.
He says that in the American Utopia essay.
Yeah, he's from the very beginning of the essay, he's very explicit that all the questions that he's posing, maybe not in this book, I don't remember specifically, but I mean they are posed in this book, but he kind of knocks that tower over in a very ignominious way, and this has to do with that outlaw comment that you mentioned earlier, I think. And I think part of maybe we can go back to mode D here and its relation to mode A as a repetition, perhaps.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
I think it comes down to maybe a misrecognition of being an outlaw with or for, or that being a misrecognition of a lawful fidelity to the truth of an accident, which is non-illustrative, or a surprising accident in particular.
A lawful fidelity to the truth of an accident, which is
non-illustrative. And I think that that's where the kind of a connection between outlaw and truth and trust and law itself comes from.
no. This is a phrase that you're reading from the American Utopian essay.
Yes, almost exactly.
Huh.
And throughout the essay, he has like a very intentionally he uses humor intentionally. I honestly, it's been like a year or two since I've read it, so I can't go into details here. But I would highly recommend it just as someone who is entertained by these chats.
Yep. Oh, that sounds great. Yeah, no, this is great, comrades. Well, one thing I'll say in closing is, yeah, we're gonna have this summer we'll bring in a Jameson scholar to join us for a conversation, like we did with Panagiotis. So towards that end, if you have thoughts on who to invite, let me know. Anna Cornblue, Robert Talley, but perhaps there's people that perhaps there's others too. So we can ponder that, and yes, and do let me know. Kiarostami, Abbas Kiarostami, the Iranian film director. I've only seen like one of his films many years ago when I was a student of Farhang. He's a former professor of mine when I went to AU, and he's going to join us for the Joan Kopchek seminar. But it would be good to start to discuss and watch Kiarostami films. And I'll put Farhang's book, which is, we don't yet have Kopchek's book because it's like whatever, it's hard to get from MIT Press. But I'll put Farhang's book because he wrote a book on Lacanian theory and Iranian cinema, which is a very interesting book, actually. So I'll share that. But I think it would be good for us to start to really dig into his work. So if somebody could find out, A, how to get access to his films, and here I mean like pirated, I guess. I don't know how to do that. And then like B, can we either like do a watch party, or if not, can you like share a link and people like watch it on their own and then we discuss it another time? because I think it's going to be much richer to go into the Kopjek event having some familiarity with this filmmaker. Right? So I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer for that. I'll throw it out there. Maybe somebody will bite at a later time. Just like, reach out to me.
Could you type the name just in the chat of the filmmaker?
Oh yeah, about Kyoto. Yeah, yeah. Kiarostami. Yeah. There's there we go. Yeah. So Daniel Holmes is recommending Close Up. There it is. Already on YouTube, full. Very nice. With English subtitles. This is one of his best known works. So let us look into that and maybe others as well. Nice. Okay, great. All right, my friends. Well, it's been real and productive. And I mean, I can't believe we finished this book in such short time. My God. It was a lot of freaking work. Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, thank you, Connor, for presenting. And Conrad told me that he couldn't come today because of some internet issues. So, anyways, hope you guys have a great 4th. And I sure wish we could like meet up in person, If anybody's in the DC area, hit me up. Talk soon. Peace out. Bye.